Hi, I'm Chris Skinner, and I have known BAI for more years than I care to mention, man and boy. And I'm delighted they've invited me to join you at their 2030 conference, looking back over the last decade as to what happened in financial services and looking forward a little bit towards the next decade to 2040 and what might happen in the future. I guess the reason why we wanted to look at this past decade is that so much has happened. It's been a real phenomena in that what we've seen is in 2020, you may remember 10 years ago when we had this thing called coronavirus, we fast forwarded, pretty much we all thought we fast forwarded into 2030, but actually we didn't. We just fast forwarded what had been bubbling during the 2010s and implemented them in 2020. And now in 2030, we've come so much further. And when I look back at the last 10 years, I guess the easiest way to look back at the last 10 years and at the next 10 years is to think about how politically, economically, socially, and technologically we've changed. In the USA at the start of the decade, we had the change of power from the Republican, the late Donald Trump, to the late Joe Biden. And, we went through a lot of change from being full of hope to full of hate to full of healing. Now with President Harris in the mid-2020s, we restored the health of the nation and changed the way we look at things. In particular, she was very driven by the ESG agenda, the environmental social governance agenda that says we have to do good for society, good for the planet, by behaving responsibly as a government. And finally, as we entered the late 2020s, President Musk has made a real difference with higher ambitions, as you know from the projects in space that he was working on for many years, and now has implemented a clear multi-planetary program for not just America, but the world, but America leading the development of those technologies. And that was very much driven by the tensions between China and America. I think that's the reason why President Musk was brought into power, because back in the start of the decade, we had these technological players taking technological leadership with unicorns from Tencent, Alibaba, Ping An, Baidu, and a lot of the shift of power, of political power in particular, but more than that, technological power, social power, power to Asia and specifically to China. In China, we were seeing more people coming out of universities with engineering, science, technological degrees than any other nation. In 2023, in fact, more Chinese students graduated in STEM focused studies than the whole of the population of the USA. So that says something, and is the reason why the Chinese were the first to really start to build the settlements on Mars that had been the ambition of people like President Musk and President Harris. And so it's this tension that's led to what is now the way in which we think very differently. We are thinking much more as a global enterprise. In fact, it's quite good that between President Ma of China and Musk of America, that we've managed to forge an alliance to jointly colonize Mars rather than having this as a competitive race between nations. And I'm also delighted in the way in which other nations have joined that task, such as the Indians. And with all of this focus upon multiplanetary, we have to recognize that just in a decade, we've changed from being focused on our nations to focused on our planet. And I think that's been one of the biggest factors. It's also changed the whole way in which we think about economics and business and commerce, because during the last century, Milton Friedman drove our focus to be very much one of having a responsibility to make profit, shareholder capitalism, and driving resources and activities to always increase profits as long as it's legal. And the question that came up, and often does come up, is, does that mean we should just make money at the expense of society? I remember when Jamie Dimon retired from JP Morgan Chase, and he introduced a lot of change around what I call stakeholder capitalism, serving the needs of society, the environment, the community, the people who work within the business, the customers of the business, not just the shareholders of the business. And this was encapsulated in a commitment back in the late 2010s, in fact, to what's now known widely, and we all buy into, stakeholder capitalism, delivering value to all of our stakeholders, not just our shareholders. At the time, there was a lot of lip service to this. We saw a lot of businesses actually talking about it, but not actually delivering. Yet, going back to the ESG agenda, the environmental social governance agenda, it neatly tied between President Harris's agenda of health for America as a community, as a society, as a country, and the integration of the USA and China and India and other nations in multiplanetary exploration, and the social implications of that this led to business changing. And I guess the last decade, the biggest thing we saw was purpose-driven business being the lead focus in finance, in trade, in commerce, in all aspects of society, in travel, you name it. And in fact, a lot of that did come out of that coronavirus whirlwind that we went through in 2020, 2021, where specifically a lot of businesses were hurting. And as they came out of that, they realized that they had to stand for something. If you don't stand for something, you fall down. And economically, I think that purpose and stakeholder and the whole environmental social governance agenda has been the beating drum of how the last decade can be summarized in how we've changed and how we think. For financial services, that's been something that's been brought upon us partly politically and regulatory wise, but specifically because of our customers. I'm obviously of an age where I'm moving towards the late customer demographic that's no longer as relevant as the next customer demographic. And we have the millennials who are now, in fact, many starting to move towards retirement and 401ks. We've got the Gen Zs, who are the main people who run our businesses and our banks, and then the iGen, the guys who were raised on iPads, who are now actually our new workforce and our new customers. And these new customers, new workforce, and our management who have actually been acutely aware of the way in which the world needed to change, have been a driving force for change. Specifically, when we went through 2020 and the lockdown, I guess the major difference is that we stopped people having to work in cities, in offices. People can work wherever they want. And that's a fantastic change in society and the way in which we do things, because now you can be out of Silicon Valley, out of Wall Street, out of New York, out of anywhere. You can just work wherever you feel you want to work. And as you know, that has had huge restructuring of our real estate markets, of our investment and asset management markets, the way in which we think about property, and equally the rise of digital assets. But I guess the biggest issue that's been faced is that the post-pandemic start of the decade created this huge debt mountain. And then we equally have a huge market of people who've come through those years and retired. And the majority of our population is now old. And we don't have enough young workers, particularly young skilled workers, wherever they are located, to replace the requirements to pay down that debt. And so Europe and America particularly have been struggling with this. And again, that's fueled the escalation of the multiplanetary colonization of China and India ahead of the USA, although we are just about keeping up. And it's also fueled a whole way in which society thinks differently about things. As I say, they've brought the purpose-driven ESG agenda, doing good for society and the planet before profit, to the table. They forced that upon us. That was bubbling in the 2010s with the Extinction Rebellion, climate emergency, activist, consumer and young people, but now they are everywhere. You cannot ignore them. They storm our offices where there are offices, our branches where there are branches, our government buildings where there are government buildings. In fact, in many ways, it's a good thing that we've got rid of most of those buildings and most of that structure of having everybody concentrated in small groups in large cities, and can distribute and democratize things so much more across the country, across the world. And so there are advantages to the change we saw in the last decade. Specifically, I think technologically, we've seen a major change in that the last decade has digitalized everything we do. We came out of the Great Depression of the 2020s with a K-curve economy, with the upside of the K proving to be the digital economy and the downside of the K proving to be the physical economy. Just as offices and high streets and main streets have disappeared, they've now appeared in different forms electronically on our smartphones, smartwatches, smart wearables. We've seen everything moving from offline to online, but it's such an old term, online. I don't like to use it. I prefer to look at the actual things that happen, such as the closing of all of our shopping malls, because they're no longer needed. And the rise of connectivity via the internet. So we are all connected globally, but we work locally. I'm making this presentation to an American audience in a small room in a place in the middle of Poland, in a rural village, because I can. And that's been something that for the last 10 years has been rising faster and faster. The late Queen was a bit of a trendsetter in this space, as are others. But now we don't even do this. We hologram meetings. We meet in a three-dimensional way, which I could not even have conceived 10 years ago. And this is enabled by the iWatch and the other things that came into play during the last 10 years. It allows us to project ourselves three-dimensionally over distance. You know, there is no distance between us anymore. And I guess when we bring it back to financial services, one of the greatest changes socially and technologically and economically has been the activist consumer who was around in the 2010s and 2020s, actually recognizing they don't want to deal with government and finance the way that I grew up dealing with government and finance. I accepted that the government controlled the money supply and the government controlled the law. These guys don't. And this is one of the things that really made me wake up in the last 20 years to the fact that I've made a lot of money out of cryptocurrencies. I did bet quite heavily on some of them, like Bitcoin. I didn't on XRP, which I don't believe in. But the cryptocurrency technological change has changed the whole of banking and finance. The biggest bank in the world today are companies like Square, PayPal, and Coinbase. Who would have predicted that 10 years ago? Luckily, some custodial services and treasury services managed to convert to keep up with that demand of the customer. And it was the demand of the customer that drove this change. The demand of the customer is one where they want things in their control, not in the control of banks and governments and business. They want it decentralized and democratized. And I think that's been the radical change of the last decade, as evidenced by the ascendancy of President Elon Musk. You know, that he represents the people, and he does that by giving power to the people through technology. In summary, in technology, our greatest challenge today is the lack of ability to manage people because they manage themselves. The demand for privacy and to own sovereign identities is what we saw emerging in the last 20 years, and I think will be the struggle for the next 20, because we've seen, as I've already mentioned, the tensions between nations like China, India, and America. And yet at the same time, we've seen the global democratization and decentralization of people's ability to do things via the network. And so the age of identity politics versus the privacy of the individual has been our greatest challenge in traditional financial services, that's been actually leveraged very heavily by the fintech community, who are still very aggressive in their targeting and taking over some of the elements of what traditional financial services providers do. In fact, what most notably in the last decade, the fintech companies that have succeeded the most are those that have not competed with traditional banks, and they've left traditional banks with the things that actually have become fairly irrelevant: the physical stores, the dealing with fiat money. The fintech companies that are most successful today pivoted and focused upon the cryptocurrency community, the digital currency community, and the dealing with specific financial markets that weren't being serviced well by financial firms through the network, from payments through to identity and privacy. And that's been the biggest change for me. And when I look at the next decade, and I look back at the last decade, I think there's so many questions that these things raise in my own mind. We ask questions all the time. And can we answer those questions? We ask questions all the time about where the future is going and how we can predict the future from the past. And that's the reason why I look back in the last 10 years to try and look forward to the next 10. Today, we live in a global local community. We work globally from our local office, wherever that office happens to be established. Today, we deal with people based on instant recognition of who they are and their identity, but only getting a persona that's anonymized of who they are and their identity. We don't get all their data, but we are truly digital today. We're not just trying to do digital, we have to be digital. And the most successful financial firms over the last decade and through the next decade, such as PayPal, Square, JP Morgan Chase, are those that made that pivot or focused on those services. In particular, what's interesting for me is so many financial firms, particularly the big ones, that managed to pivot in the last decade to be cloud native rather than cloud-based. So many companies made tactical decisions to move to cloud-based services in the 2020s and have now disappeared. And there's a clear dichotomy between those that built a business that was actually designed to be born on the internet, to be cloud native, versus those that actually tried to evolve to the internet to be cloud-based. It's almost like the dichotomy between the digital immigrants and the digital natives. We have the banks and the financial firms that were cloud native versus those that were cloud-based. And the cloud-based companies are the ones that unfortunately are no longer with us. And in fact, many of the major movements of banks to be acquired by fintechs has been quite interesting. Specifically, I think the acquisition of Deutsche Bank by Revolut was a major moment that woke us all up in 2025. And since then, we've seen so many more of the institutions that we used to believe were rock solid, proving to be actually quite flaky because they didn't get digital and technological change in the last decade. In final conclusion, I think the biggest thing for me, and I've been campaigning for years about this, is that yes, we had to be omni, but those that focused upon omni-channel are the ones that are no longer with us. Those that focused on omni-access and giving their customer control are the ones who have thrived, survived, succeeded, and will continue to thrive, survive, and succeed in the next decade. I trust that that very brisk recollection of the last 10 years and some views around the next 10 is of use. And once again, thank you very much to BAI for inviting me to their major 2030 conference.